good morning, good noon, Jessie James Beads. It's Jem here reporting to you from the United Kingdom. We're a little bit weather blown at the moment, but it's a beautiful sunshiny afternoon now. I hope you've had a beautiful day no matter what it is you've been getting up to. For today's live, we're going to be working with the Aurora Borealis mix, and it's absolutely stunning. I want to put you down to the board so you can just have a look at what we're going to create, but also some of the beads that you get in this gorgeous blend. So these are the beads that we're going to be using. However, I'd definitely be popping these into a pair of beautiful, beautiful earrings. They're so detailed and the colour is absolute perfection. So it's the Aurora Borealis mini mix, an absolutely gorgeous colour collection. How have you been today? What have you been up to? I hope life is treating you well and that all things are good in your world. As ever, Facebook is helping me out immensely by not letting me into the Jessie James page, so I'm flying solo and rather without any ability to see what's happening. What I'll do is at the end of today's live is I'll hop back on as soon as I possibly can and catch up with all of your comments. I'm just going to say hello to each and every one of you. Big, massive, squeezy, all heart from myself and the entire Jessie James Beads crew. So Aurora Borealis captured my heart, which is why we're going to make a bracelet together today called Capture My Heart. Really, really gorgeous blend of colours. My absolutely favourite tone is purple and all that purple brings with it. So let's have another look at that bead blend whilst everybody is joining today. So that's what we're looking at creating, which could, as somebody commented the other week, that they saw one of the bracelets I'd made and they would absolutely turn it into a necklace. Obviously, you've got loads and loads of beads to work with. What I'm going to do is just drop this down. These are the beads that we're not going to use today. These are the beads that we're using today. So you obviously get quite a lot in the bead mix. This is everything that I didn't get around to using in the project. So you have got so much left here that you absolutely could turn into an absolutely adorable little necklace, just adding extra beads on the end with more beading thread and so on and so forth. Now I'm often asked which beading thread it is that I use. Let's jiggle that pot out of the way. I tend to use for bracelets and regular necklaces the Beadalon 7 strand. Gives you the dimensions on there in case you're not familiar with it. It's perfectly strong enough for a product like today. If you're making jewellery that's incredibly bead heavy and has multiple layers, you can always put 2 threads through if you feel it necessary. It's a really useful beading thread and it's my absolute go-to. Bright is the colour that we're working with today. So what I'm going to show you is this central piece, and then I'm going to show you one side of the bracelet for you to work with me today. And then if you want to work the other side back, you can always just watch back again if you feel that you need to, or follow your own work. So hopefully that is all as clear as mud, as we say in the UK. Let's pop some of these bits and bobs out of the way and look at how we came up with this design. So all heart is, I think, probably Sarah's favourite thing to say. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm putting words in her mouth. Who knows? So what we like to think about is the heart and it being there to show love to one another. It doesn't have to be romantic love. It could be love of family also. So what I'm going to do is show you this central section and then how to create up the link and then how to use these beautiful, I don't know if you describe them as spacers or charms. Quite often you see spacers or charms used in a multiple of ways, which I think it's why it's absolutely wonderful to get them in the mixes. I've used it as a connector. So obviously you can use that just as an earring by itself. Let's have a look at one by itself for a hot second. I think these are really, really beautiful, and it's something that we can recreate in wire at a later date if you fancy it. It's a gorgeous little doohickey, but we're going to use it as a connector. Now, if you were making a multi-stranded necklace, it would make a really beautiful connection point to take 3 strands in either direction. So you've got lots of uses for those, but this for me is the ultimate expression of Aurora Borealis. I will one day get to see that in Iceland, maybe. I'm told you can see it in parts of Scotland at certain times of the year. That's kind of far as well, so one day you never know. These colours are just so me. And I also wanted to show you with these little leaf beads, let's just grab 3 of those to the ready, how if you stack them super tight, you can get them to cluster. Now, you guys are all beady savvy, but for people that work with wire, we don't often use beads necessarily in different ways. So I'm going to show you how if you put a little bit of tension on those leafy type beads, you can get them to cluster and form their own little vine, which I think is kind of cute. We've also got some little beads there to work with as well. So I'm just going to pop these out of the way for the moment. And I'm going to check in with the Book of Face to see if it's going to let me see anything that's going on today. Let's give that a try. Oh, hello. We are in. I can see the comments. So, Sandy, hello. Abigail, hello. Jimmy Vivi, hello. If I've mispronounced your name, thousands of apologies. Sandy, Lilia, Anne from sunny California. Lilia, we can work with each other. Love the bracelet, says Anne. Sandy, I think so too. And smiley cracked up face, which is my favourite face. Celia is in from snowy Lancashire. Hello to you, my loves. I'm so pleased I can see your comments. It makes my life so much easier when I can respond to queries straight away. So we're going to work up this first central section to begin with. Now, fingerprints on the beads are absolutely entirely at your discretion. You don't have to leave them on. You can polish them off if you like. So I'm just going to steal that away for a second. Hello, Donna. Good to see you. Thanks for hopping on in today. I've dropped the bead on the floor, everyone. Bead down, bead down. Gosh almighty, that went on a journey. It's now got even more fingerprints than it had on it a second ago because it went all the way over and disappeared. So we're going to make up the central section first, which, as I mentioned earlier, you absolutely can make into the centerpiece of a necklace if you just simply want to extend these 2 arms all the way around. So why don't we just pop that up in the corner for a moment so we can focus on what we're going to start with. Let's put the rest of those beads out of the way. Now, I made the demonstration piece in a silver coloured round wire using 18 gauge. The reason I like to use copper is that it shows up really nicely on my camera. Even if I change to a different colour board, the lighting always picks out copper the best. So the actual wire that I have used is German style, which is a medium temper, in 18 gauge, and it is round wire. So entirely up to you what colourway you use. As ever, I'm going to start by smoothing and warming that wire through. And we're working with around about 8 inches to begin with. It's slightly more than we need, but we're not going to skimp. We want to have a beautiful piece to work with and a lovely finished product which is nice and strong and safe. So this huge central pendant bead had no problem going on the straight end of my wire. And the reason I've chosen 18 gauge for the core is that it's nice and strong. Now, if you were to make this in 20 gauge, it would be as strong because I'm going to show you how to layer that wire up so that it does remain nice and strong for you. Carmen is in. Lilia, that's a beautiful bead. Catherine is in from Futureland, Australia. That's a great name. Teresa is in. Thank you, my darling. Good afternoon to you also. So we're going to make a nice strong core for this. If you felt that you were more comfortable with a 20 gauge, a slightly lighter wire, you can absolutely use that because we will layer up the wires so that you have the option of building strength with added layers rather than all in one go. So it doesn't really matter, honestly, which one you use, but I'm just showing you that these beads are fantastic because you have got that good drill aperture to work with. Now, I've centralised my bead just to keep it from going on the floor again, to be quite honest. And what I want to do is leave a little space either side before turning a wrapped loop on either side. Now, one of the reasons I've got such a very long tail of wire either side out of that central focal bead is to give me enough space to just pop lots and lots of coils coming back towards the bead. So the first thing that I'm going to do is grab a hold of my bent chain nose pliers, making sure that my bead is still centralised, and I'm going to turn a right angle up on one side to begin with. You can then move the bead away slightly if you like. I'm just going to grip it with my non-dominant hand. If you struggle with doing that, you can even take it off the end of the piece. It doesn't really matter. The next thing that I'm going to do is to turn this right angled bend into a lovely, smooth, round wrapped loop. Now, if you are newer to wire working, this is something that people often get discombobulated with, and I want to show you that it is actually something that you do not need to fear. So I've got my wrapped loop. My wire is warm because we smoothed it through a couple of moments ago. I'm going to pop those round nose pliers onto that length of wire and just rotate that back around. You can do that in a couple of moves if you like. I tend to make my wrapped loops in 2 moves, so I use my round nose pliers to create the first half circle shape, pop them back into position, and then draw that tail all the way around to complete the move. I can speak English sometimes. So you don't have to do that in 2 moves, but in terms of showing you how that design builds up, it's a really neat way to show you that that can be easy to achieve. You can do it all in one once you get the hang of it. Let's see what's going on in the comments. Hello to Sue from Lancaster, Ohio. We've got Lancaster in England and Lancaster in Ohio. Hi everyone, it's from Cynthia. Margaret is in Edinburgh. Mary is in from NC. There we go. Okay, so we've got our circular form. What I'm going to do is make sure that that's nice and flat. It's in a straight line to that central core wire that we're working with. And I'm then just going to hold the circular form. I'm not squashing down where the wires cross over at all, and I'm going to bring that tail all the way around a good couple of times. Now I think I'll probably go for that many wraps, which is 3 full wraps and a bit of a swoosh that comes off the circle. And I'm just going to compress that slightly. What I'm going to do now is turn it over because I'm right dominant and this is the direction in which I have to work. So I'm going to keep it on this side. If you prefer, you can invert the whole thing. It's entirely up to you. Andrea's in from Chicago. Rosalind's in from Nevada. Robin is in saying hello everyone, and Paula is in. Good morning to you. Lovely. Thanks for joining us. The next part of your double wrapped loop to set that central bead, and again if you missed it, this is 18 gauge round wire. You can work in a medium or a soft to medium temper, it's entirely up to you. I've made the piece to show you before today's live in a medium temper German style silver colour wire. But today I'm working with the warm tones of bare copper, which is a little bit softer, purely because it shows up better on the camera for you to see. Perfect way to start the weekend, says Cheryl. Thank you. Catherine's in from Australia. Lovely to see you, my darlings. The next thing that we're going to do is estimate the distance between where that loop starts, where that turns away to become a circular form, and the bead itself. We're going to estimate that and plus just a tiny little bit to give us a margin for error, and I'll show you how that can work. So if we take that slightly wider than we need to before turning a right angle, always tricky to do that without getting my finger in the way and just showing you nothing but my hand rather than what we're trying to achieve. Lilia, here in the very middle of England we have had 0 snow, but we have had quite scary winds. My summer house is no longer a summer house. It is very much, it needs to, it's gone basically. So we've had wind but no snow, but I know lots of places up in Yorkshire and Lancashire are getting quite snowy at the moment. So I'm going to do exactly as I did on the first half. I've just inverted it because I'm right dominant. I'm going to pop those round nose pliers in. Now if you need help remembering whereabouts on the round nose pliers you created that size, you can use a marker pen to mark on them. But what I'm going to do is just eyeball it and see how it goes. Just turn that around and I'll show you the one manoeuvre version this time. You can do that in 2 moves if you prefer. Now that's not terribly round, is it? So I can just make that slightly rounder. I think we had this conversation a couple of months ago about re-roundinating things. So I've just edited that slightly so it's a little bit more a round shape rather than a random, I don't know quite what it was. It was slightly more ovoid, I think. I've created a shape that is fairly similar to the one on the other end. And then again, I'm just going to straighten that up to make sure that the circle of wire follows on from that centre core and that I haven't messed it up too much by faffing around. I'm then going to support the circle shape, but not where the wires cross over one another. And then I'm going to draw that tail all the way around, and I'm going to repeat the number of coils that I did on the first side, which was 3 full coils and a bit. And what you'll see is that there's a bit of a gap, and that's absolutely fine. That is exactly what I want to happen right now, because it allows me to show you how to even up your wraps when you're creating a centerpiece. This is basically a type of rosary linking. It's a wrapped loop on either end. I'm very, very carefully and respectfully just going to squish up those loops so that they're nice and tidy, and make sure that everything is indeed straight. So what you can see is we've got a bit of a gap going on. We don't want a gap in there. We want to hold this nicely and securely. So the way that we would get rid of the gap is to take these coils a little further around, and you can do that by hand if you have the finger strength. If not, you can use the soft side of your pliers. We need to always be aware that we're working in this instance with a treated glass bead. We don't want to smash it or crash it or score it or chip it in any way. So I tend to use this side of my round nose pliers, and it just makes for a much happier time. So what I'm doing is I'm just bringing that tail of wire around, like in a helix format, just a little bit further on one side before flipping it over. Whichever is the easiest way for you to do. I don't know which is the easiest way for me to show you. Almost used the wrong side of the pliers. I'm just going to squeeze that down a little bit until we have filled the gap and there's no longer any movement. So there's a bit more to go just yet. So I can hold the loop, draw the tail around a little bit more, very carefully tighten up that loop. We're almost out of wiggle room. So I want to turn the design over again, draw that last little bit of wire up, squeeze it into position. We've now got no more wiggle room, but we've got an equal number of wraps or an equal distance between the loop and that central feature bead. Do we have any questions so far? Margaret said, hugs, we had snow yesterday. There is your beautiful face. I don't know. We're keeping it out of the way. And Andrea says less than a foot this time. My gosh, that's an awful lot of snow. We've not had heavy snow here in a little while. So you can see that we've tightened up the gap between our wrapped loop and the central focal bead. So now we need to trim away the excess wire. I'm going to show you on this side first because it's easy. I'm using the flush side of those cutters as close to the end of that wire where it comes away from the core. Give that a little bit of a squeeze to get rid of that excess. And then we just need to tuck that last tiny little bit away. So this is the time you're going to be very gentle and just push that down so it's smooth. If you feel that you haven't left yourself enough room, you can undo the wire just a tiny, tiny bit. So you can see that that rotates more freely now. Go in with the flush side against the coil. Whoops. It's almost my finger then. Let's not do that. So I've cut the wire, but it doesn't want to come off. So there we go. I was being very ginger and delicate with it then. So again, we're just going to tuck that last little bit of wire away very, very gently against that central focal bead. Hi everyone, says Linda. Hello my darling, how are you? So let's just hop up here for a hot second. So that is the most nerve-wracking part of this tutorial done. You've got your spacing between those two loop shapes either side of that beautiful focal bead. Once you've set that, job's a good one. We can move on to what I like to think of as the most fun part of this Capture Your Heart tutorial. I absolutely love this design. Any big flat facing bead will work with something like this, whether it be gemstone, whether it be glass, or even a beautiful metal spacer bead. So let's pop down now with the wire to add that heart decal. There we are. So we fitted that central section. That's all nice and safe. There's not much movement in it. Now I've managed to orient it so that the loops are in the same direction as my central focal. If yours are at an angle and you don't want to risk moving the bead, it doesn't matter in the slightest. We will simply orient the next rosary link slightly differently so that that will accommodate it. Please don't ever feel that you have to replicate something exactly. There's usually a way that we can accommodate anything that's going on. Now, what I would say is I'm going to grip hold of this very carefully and not throw it on the floor like I did before. Let's give that a quick polish. There. So I've removed some of those smutty fingerprints, which is good. For the next section of the tutorial, you may move to 20 gauge if you are less used to wire. And I will show you with both what this looks like with 20 gauge and what it looks like with 18 gauge by doing one on either side. Now, if I can just show you the sample bracelet for a second. This has been made with 18 gauge round silver colour medium temper wire over the face of that focal bead. If you flip it over, there isn't anything on the back because I quite like the idea of that being super comfortable. With the piece that I'm going to make with you now, what I'm going to do is make on one side with the 20 gauge, which is super soft and fluid by comparison, and then I'm going to grab a hold of an extra piece of the 18 gauge and make with it on the other side. Now, the only reason I'm doing this is so that I can show you how the two different wires look and how the two different wires react when you're trying to form the shapes. In wear, I would only suggest putting one face on. If you're going to wear it as a bracelet, it's going to be much more comfortable if it's just the bead on the wrist. So let me start by showing you the wire. I've got an overly long length here because it was in my scrap pot of the 20 gauge. This is raw copper, but that's just because it shows up really nicely on camera. And I've got an overly long length, which is around about 14 inches. You would probably only need about 8 inches again. But like I said, this was in my scrap pot, so I'm using it. What we're going to do is warm that through nicely. And as I say, I'm working now with the 20 gauge. You can work with the 18 gauge if that's your preference. I'll show you what the two look like side by side. Teresa's in from Tampa in Florida, where there is no snow. The one and only time I went to Florida in 89 to 1990, it snowed and there were grown people running around laughing and giggling because they'd never seen snow before. It was brilliant. It was an absolutely fabulous time. It was only a couple of flakes, but my claim to fame with Florida is that when I went, it did snow. Monica says you make it look easy. That's very, very kind of you. Buena Park, California is Maria's homeland. Welcome to you. And Robin says, hi Jem, we got 78 degrees today. I am ever so slightly jealous. So I'm centralising my length of that slightly lighter 20 gauge wire, and I'm finding the middle, and I'm just going to put a really nice angle in there. So if you want to have a very sharp point down at the bottom, close it further than you want it to be closed, and then open it back out again, and you'll find that that point is just slightly firmer down at the base. You don't have to do that if you want a nice rounded bottom to your heart. It's entirely up to you. So the next thing we're going to do is work with our round nose pliers. Let me just turn the light up slightly as the daylight is starting to fade here. So just bring that up slightly. We might get a bit more glare, but it means that you'll be able to see what's happening. So what we're going to do is make sure that the side of the wire is nice and warm. I'm going to pop those round nose pliers in, and I'm going to do it approximately the distance from one side of the bead to the other. So I need to bring that in a little bit, like so. That's where I'm holding it. I'm going to rotate that around and then draw the wire underneath and round. So you can see that we're making the first side of our heart. Now that's a little bit large. We want that circular section to be closer to the middle of the bead. So if you make it too small, you can rotate it in the opposite direction. If you make it too large, you can simply rotate it round a little bit further and then grab hold of the end of that wire and draw it out to the side. So you can see I've slightly mashed that, but I'm just going to re-roundinate it now, like so, before laying it over the surface of the bead. That's exactly where I want it to be. So I now need to just pop that focal bead out of the way, flip the design over so I don't twang the camera again, and then roll those round nose pliers around to match as best I can on the other side. Now what you'll see is I've got one wire travelling off on the upside and one travelling off on the underside. Doesn't matter one little bit. They can both be on top, they can both be underneath. It doesn't matter at all. Now before you go any further, what we're going to do, because this is the lighter wire, this is the 20 gauge wire that I'm demonstrating with right now. And what I'm going to do is just squish those circular shapes at the top. Now I want you to see very closely that when I'm squishing those circular shapes, I'm not squishing anywhere where the wires cross one over the other. It is solely the circular sections at the top, and I'm going to open and close the pliers a couple of times, making sure that those two central pieces aren't overlapping, and just work hardening that wire slightly. I'm going to flip that over, pinch the bit that we've just work hardened, and give that a squash and a squeeze too. Squash and a squeeze, squash and a squeeze, so that we've work hardened the shape of the heart. Now if I waggle that around, you'll see that that's much firmer than if we hadn't done any work hardening at all. Now you can obviously take a lot longer to make sure that you're happy with the symmetry of your heart. You can even have one side higher than the other. You can put a funky little tail at the bottom. It's your heart that's being captured, so you can make it exactly how you want to. So what we're going to do is pop that heart. I'm now going to apply more fingerprints to the focal bead. Sorry about that. But I want to sit my heart in the centre of that focal bead and press firmly over the top with my thumb. Now this hides the heart shape from you, but what it means is I can draw that wire that's coming out of the right hand side of the heart over the top of the design. Let me just check back on my streaming software that that's close enough and clear enough. Yep, you can see where that's gone. And what we're going to do is take the tail of wire and wrap that around in the neatest coil you can muster, as many times as you can manage before we get to that wrapped loop. Now, the reason that having a longer length of wire to work with is useful every single time, this again was about 15 inches, which I thought was going to be too much. Now, what I would normally say is just take that tail and tuck it through the end, cut it off and sneak it away into the space just down inside where we created that wrapped loop. But if you've got an overly long section of wire, you've got other choices. You can wind it back again towards that heart shape in the centre, and then pop a little little coil on the end. So you've got choices of things that you want to do. What I'm going to do is show you how to cut that off and just snuggle the end away tidily. Just joining from Oregon, what have you missed? We've put a core wire through the centre of the focal bead. We've added wrap loops on either side, and now we're popping a heart over the surface. So if I flip this upside down, whoops, almost got that one in on the action also. I'm going to again press down on the heart and draw the wire. Now this time it went on the top side when I had it oriented the other way. So if I flip it back to the original orientation, the wire that came from the right hand side of the heart popped over the top of that coil leading to the wrapped loop. So because I'm flipping this upside down now, the wire that comes out of what is now the right hand side of the heart will need to come down underneath the coil that leads to the wrapped loop. And all I'm doing is I'm just matching them, but it can be disorienting if you're not used to working with wire and flipping things around all the time. So again, I'm going to put my thumb over the top of that heart shape and pinch it into position whilst I bring that tail of wire around. And because we're working with that 20 gauge instead of the 18 gauge, it's super fluid and easy. So I just neaten that last little coil up that went slightly awry. That's better. What we're going to do is just trim away the excess, hopefully without pinging the camera. You can see we've got a little stubby tail there, and all I'm going to do is push that stubby tail of wire inside the section leading to the core wire. So I'll do that again on the far side. I think we can probably get one more loop around here. I'm going to trim the tail away. Now what I would say at this point is these lengths of wire that I've just trimmed off, in 20 gauge wire, those lengths of wire are not scrap at all. I will make those into earring wires. So a lot of you laugh when I say it's going in the scrap pot. If you've watched me for a couple of years now, my scrap pot is probably more famous than I am. So I will make those into ear wires later. So what I'm going to do is take that tail and give it a bit of a squash and a squeeze and just get the very end to sit down inside that loop that we created at the beginning of the design. Just try and squeeze everything down until it's neat. So if you're wearing this on the wrist, I would say go for one side only. So that would be super comfortable because there's nothing underneath to scratch on your skin. What I'm going to do now is show you the same technique but using the slightly heavier gauge wire. So I'm just going to unspool a shorter length this time. And I'm just going to warm it on the reel for a second. So I'm just pulling thumb and forefinger over and under. This is 18 gauge raw copper. And I've just unspooled maybe 7 or 8 inches. So I'm going to repeat the same thing I did with the heart shape here, but I'm going to show you how much different it is with the harder, stronger 18 gauge wire. Linda is in. Hello. Debbie is in. So pretty, thank you very much. Oh my gosh, I don't think I can pronounce that. Adian Dax, hello from there. If I've mispronounced it, I'm so sorry. Margaret says beautiful. Thank you, beautiful lady. So what we're going to do is repeat the first half of that focal section, finding the centre of the wire that we've just cut. And this is much shorter than you would normally need. And the reason I'm doing it shorter is because I don't want to waste wire. I won't need to do all of these coils around the end. So again, create that V shape down at the bottom. You can make that asymmetric, you can make it really rounded, you can make it much sharper. Absolutely, the choice is yours. So if I just pop that up to the top for a second, what doesn't make it professional looking, Lilia, is all the thumbprints I've put all over it. So you would probably want to polish those before you went to sell it or gift it perhaps. So again, if you missed the heart forming right now, we're going to go again with the round nose pliers and rotate that around to begin with, and then bring the tail around. So it's a 2-step circular formation. Now, if you want to have your round forms with the wire on top, you can repeat that. You just have to think about it by doing it slightly differently. So whereas before we took that wire in a different direction, this time we're going to take it over the top and think about it a bit more. And in this piece, both of the wires coming out to the side are on top of the design. Now you can see plainly that that is completely asymmetrical. If asymmetry isn't for you, what we're going to do is pop those pliers in slightly further up the edge of the pliers so that you can make that circle shape smaller. And also then just rotate the pliers around like so. You're just rotating them to move that circle form closer to the point down at the bottom of the heart. So it just needs to go just a tiny bit further, and then you can draw that tail of wire again so that you end up with a slightly more symmetrical heart shape. So you've got another heart. We're going to put it on the back of this design. Now it probably wouldn't be quite so annoying to the skin if this was worn on an earring. Obviously it wouldn't interact with the body quite the same way. That would probably be a little bit weighty for many people though. So what I'm going to do is again lay it over that focal bead. And this time I think I'm going to take the wires underneath the core wire that runs through the centre, just to show you that you can have whatever choices it is that you want to work with. You can have whatever design choices rather. So again, I'm making sure that my circle forms are where I want them to be before I very carefully squish the circle forms at the top. I'm not pressing down anywhere where the wires cross over, and I know you must get bored of hearing me say that, but if you do go and crush one wire on top of another, you'll weaken both of those wires, and it is a stress point then. They're quite likely to fracture at some point, so we're very careful about that. So again, I'm going to lay the design over the top of the central focal bead. I'm just going to draw those wires so they come down just a little bit. Pop them into position. Make sure it's centralised on the bead where I want that to appear. Hello from very chilly Minnesota. Hello Monica, I hope you're well. Push the design into the bead. Now this is where working with the 18 gauge for this section is much trickier. I want to get that bend in the wire, and then I'm going to flip it over and get it exactly the same on the other side to make sure that my heart stays centralised. What tends to happen is as you're putting that bend in, the design can move across the central focal bead one way or another. So what you'll notice here is that they're much farther apart. These bends are too far outwards. We need them to be closer in. And that's just what happens when you're working with a slightly heavier gauge wire. It's got slightly more of a mind of its own. So all I'm going to do is just reform those bends by pulling them slightly tighter, looking twice to make sure that that heart is where I want it before wrapping around that coil again. So I'm going to do 1 and a bit coils on the one side. Make sure that I'm happy with that position before doing 1.5 coils on the other side. And what you can do here is take these 2 last little bits, make sure that they are cut flush on both sides and the same length. Do police those little bits of wire, please, because they're uncomfortable if they go in your foot. What we're going to do is take these tails and just make them into little coils to cover up that core wire before it becomes the wrapped loop. Now it can go outwards or it can go inwards. I kind of like it either way. On this design it came inwards towards the heart. So for this one I think we'll take it the other way, slightly outwards. I'll just do the one side because we're only going to make one side of the bracelet together. So I'm going to pinch the very end of that wire, very close to the end of my pliers. And I'm going to start rotating that around to make the coil. So we've started off, we've got a one complete circle and then a little bit more. So before I go any further, I'm just going to flatten that down and get that as tightly coiled as I can before just pushing that in very small movements until that coil sits over the top of the wrapped loop we made. That wasn't terribly good English, was it? So you can see that we've added an extra layer of strength to that core. That's really nice and strong now, which is one of the reasons for using the 18 gauge wire. If I flip this over now, you'll see what it looks like with the 20 gauge, slightly thinner wire. So it's entirely up to you which one you use and which one pleases your aesthetic values. So let's flip that back over and look at the other pieces that we're going to make together today. So this is basically a Rosary Link. Now you can do this with the 20 gauge wire with no problem whatsoever. So I'm just going to grab a small section of 20 gauge. And it only needs to be, I'll just cut it and then I'll measure it because I can never estimate it until I've cut it. I know how much I need, probably about 3.5 inches. So again, warm and straighten, warm and straighten, warm and straighten. So I'm going to give that a lovely smooth through. Not only does it improve the appearance of your wire, it makes it shiny and smooth, it makes it more fluid, and once it's cooled down, it's actually just a little bit stronger too. So the first thing that we're going to do is grab one of our charms, which I'm going to use as a link. Now you can orient these in a particular way if you want, so that you can have your link sitting thus, or you can just ignore the fact that that spiral is in the centre. It doesn't really matter. I didn't particularly choose to orient them. I just chose one of the 6 apertures through which to put the end section of my wire. So I've got that 3.5 to 4 inches of nicely warmed 20 gauge round wire. And I'm going to turn a right angle on that. And what we're going to do is a wrapped loop. But what makes this a Rosary Link is that before we close the wrapped loop, we're going to add something into it. So I'm showing you 2 pieces now in one. So I'm going to rotate the pliers around to make the first part of that loop shape. Pop the pliers back in and draw the end of the wire around. Now what you'll notice, I hope, is that I have coiled the wire in a helical fashion around the pliers, around the round nose pliers, because what that means is it's much easier for me to slide on that charm. So you can see how easily that went on. If you make it flat, it just means that you have to open it and then close it again. So it doesn't really matter if you do make it flat, not a problem at all. So the key element of Rosary Linking is that whereby earlier on we made a wrapped loop with nothing in it, with this we're making a wrapped loop with the added fun of something being in the loop shape. Now, the first time you try it, that can be a little tricky. But it is not difficult. It takes a little getting used to. So all we're going to do is to support whatever is in the loop shape out of the way. We're going to use some fine flat pliers. And I want to just show you this as many angles as possible. So I'm just popping back to my streaming software to make sure that that can be seen. The key point when you're doing a Rosary Link is that you are supporting the round form across from one side to the other. So having slim pliers, let me just grab my chain nose pliers, slim tapered pliers like these are perfect. What we're not doing is putting any pressure on wire that crosses over. We're about to turn this into a coil. And on the other side, we're not putting any pressure at all on whatever we've captured in the loop we're about to turn into a wrapped loop. So hopefully that all makes sense. The next part that we're going to do is to take the tail of wire and turn it into a wrapped loop. Now you can do that by hand if you have strong fingertips. The more you work with wire, it's a bit like playing the guitar. You too tend to get slightly tougher skin on the end of your fingers. So if you cannot do that by fingertip, which is absolutely fine, we can employ the 2 pliers method. So I tend to sight the pliers with my dominant hand, which is my right, before putting the section that is supporting the loop into my non-dominant hand. Now I can apply a bit of pressure with this, but it's not very good at the fine motor skills. Once I've sighted the loop into my pliers, I'm going to take that little tail of wire with the second set of fine, as long as they're flat facing pliers, my chain nose pliers, my bent chain nose pliers, we're going to rotate that around until it is smooth. So if I now remove my non-dominant pliers, you can see that we've got a wrapped loop, but we've captured a thing in the loop. That's all rosary linking is. It's capturing a thing in the loop. Now sometimes it's another loop, and I'll show you that in just a second, but we're going to add a bead in the middle of all of this. So this is the most extravagant purple. I love purple. I've always loved purple. This is the purpliest purple I could hope to ever imagine. Lilia says it did make sense. Thank goodness for that. That's always good to know. So I'm going to pop my bead on. Now, a quick note on rosary linking before we go further. Let's just say hello in case I haven't seen you yet. Hello, how are you today? I hope you have a beautiful day. With rosary linking, the strength comes from the number of times that you circle around the core of your rosary linked section. I have done rosary linking in most wires from about 14 gauge, which is very tricky on the fingers, all the way down to 26 gauge wire. Now rosary linking with 26 gauge wire, if you're working with something that has very tiny drill holes, can be achieved. What I would say is that those loops on the end, when they are pulled, they turn into ovals, and then because 26 gauge is a very fine wire, it can eventually snap. However, if you want some very, very fine beads, for instance, I've worked with rough diamonds on 26 gauge wire. You can suspend them from something like an earring. Wouldn't probably make it into a bracelet. That would very much definitely be a better design to use your bead stringing material. So just a word on rosary linking, you can make it with really very fine wire, and what I tend to do is the finer the gauge of wire, the more wraps around the core. So something like 22 gauge, I'd go for 3 or 4 wraps. Something like 20 gauge, at least 2 to 3 wraps. With the 18 gauge, excuse me, I've run out of breath. That's all this talking that I've done. With the 18 gauge, as long as you get 1.5 to 2 wraps around that core wire, you're golden. It's pretty secure. Rosary linking with wire has been around forever and ever and ever, like centuries and centuries of time people have used it. So let's crack on with the next section of the tutorial today. We'll head back down to the board. Hello, how are you, Shakitia? Shakisha, if I've mispronounced your name, I'm terribly sorry. Many apologies for that. So when you're adding your central rosary link, what you're basically doing is the exact same thing as we did with the focal bead, which is a core through a bead, wrapped loops on either end. But what you're doing with rosary linking is that instead of having an empty wrapped loop like we have here, you've got a full wrapped loop like we have here. Now if you want a particular orientation, for instance this bead here, this charm rather, is going to sit better on the wrist in this orientation than up at 90 degrees. So we're going to sit that down, and what we're going to look at is where we think the loop on the other end needs to be oriented. So for me, I'm going to bring the wire up and away from the desk, loop it through the flat loop we created here on the focal bead. So I'll show you that now. Bring the right angle up and away, so that what will happen when this sits on the wrist, your charm here will sit flat against the wrist rather than at the uncomfortable and jaunty angle like so. So we're going to create a loop now. Get those pliers out of the way. So again, you can do this in one go if you like, or you can do that with 2 manoeuvres, whatever makes you happy. What we're trying to do is to get a loop shape that is centralised and flat, like so. So our bead in the middle will spin, that's absolutely fine. And what we now need to do is to insert the tail of wire coming away from that loop into our existing wrapped loop. So we push that through. Hopefully at this angle you'll be able to see. And then when we get to the crossover point, you can just push that through, and you can see now that those 2 pieces are linked together. Now, to make that nice and safe and secure, what we're going to do is another Rosary Link. So I'm going to push that flat back down again, so we've recreated the loop shape. I'm going to hold on to that loop shape again. I'm not crushing the thing that is being linked into the Rosary Link, and I'm not crushing one wire on top of another. So I'm going to take that tail all the way around. That's a little bit loose, so I'm just going to tighten that up slightly before re-supporting that side and pushing that down into position. So I'm just going to trim away now, turning it around about 50,000 times until it's in the correct orientation for me to cut for you. Again, useful for coils, maybe not quite enough for an ear wire, but useful for something. Quite thrifty in Gem's house. We're going to take that tail, push it down so that it sits neatly on that core wire. So you can see where we're up to with regards to recreating the design. You're just going to repeat on the far side. Let's have a look and see if there are any questions on that. Anyone having problems with the video freezing? Linda, I'm sorry about that. Facebook can be a tad, you know, Facebooky. So hopefully you'll be able to watch on the replay if it does get a little bit tricky for you. Now, for the last section, I'm sure you are all very familiar with bead threading. You're certainly more familiar with it than I am. That means that you will also probably, by default, be better at using crimps and crimp covers than I am. So I'm going to beg your indulgence whilst I fail miserably at using crimps and crimp covers. I'm going to do my best. Now, I've got a random assortment of crimps and crimp covers here. What I'm going to do is work with my... There we are. It's the 7-strand bright Beadalon bead stringing wire. That's the one that I have used for this project. Anything you can get through your beads will be absolutely fine. I have a short length here of around about 6 inches. And what I'm going to do to start with is just pop a length of this up through the opposing aperture in my charm. So there are 6 pieces that you could attach through. So I'm just going to use one that's opposite. Doesn't really matter which way you do it. Now I'm going to then bring all of that through so that it doubles up. I tend to double up with my bracelets just because there are fewer connective points. So rather than having a much shorter length of beading thread with a crimp at this end and a crimp at the other end, I tend to just put the beading thread through. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a hold of wire guardians, then those are absolutely perfect for a position like this because they protect against wear. What I will say is I've got jewellery that I made 12 years ago with this material and it's still going just fine. So let's bring in those other beads that we're going to use to finalise this project. So you can get 2 strands through the Tidgy rice bead colour. These are like a mother of pearl, I want to say. Once we put the mother of pearl on, we're going to slide that all the way down, and that's going to set the little U shape that we've created in the beading thread that goes through the charm. So that's nice and set now. So we've created the beginning of our tension. Next up, we're going to thread on 3 of these beautiful AB coated, I want to say lucite, leaf beads. So let's just pop the wire through, the beading thread rather. I'm so used to working with wire. There's a dog hair there, of course there is, there always is. Pop that last one on. And as that builds up, you could leave it like so if you desired, but I like the idea of flipping one over and then putting some tension into the design so you get this vine type appearance. I really like that, and the fact that this one is a different colour because they're AB half coated, so you've got purple on one side and almost a golden green on the other side. So let's bring in the rest of those beads. So what we're going to do is add in one more of the rice beads in that, again I want to say mother of pearl. It's a hot fuchsia colourway. bring that down, and then I'm going to pop in the first of my 2 crimp beads. Allow that to sit down into position, and then I'm going to pop one of these absolutely gorgeous aqua spacer beads in. You can use whatever bead order you want, and then we're going to finish off with another crimp. Pop that all the way down before creating a loop and crimping back on yourself. Now the key with this section is creating the tension. So what I would tend to do, rather than bringing the beading thread all the way through and back through both crimps, I'm going to use the first crimp to set the tension to keep my leaves in that beautiful vine shape. So if I push that down, make sure I have the tension. I'm just going to draw that out the way so you can see that in better light. You can see that we've got the tension there ready. So what I'm going to do is crimp that first crimp. Give that a really hearty squeeze. And then because we've got that little bit of space at the end where the spacer or the spiral connector, maybe it would be called, what we can then do is move everything along, and you've got the tiniest gap just to put your crimp bead cover over the top of that first crimp. And I've used a funny colour so that you can see it better on the board, at least that's my intention. Then what we're going to do is to create a loop shape. Now sometimes if I struggle with this, I tend to use a pair of pliers. You could use a reverse action tweezers if you have any, they're really handy, or a third hand, something like that. But the essence of what we're trying to do here is to create an oversized loop, push that all the way through the crimp bead and your aqua coloured spacer before drawing it down. Now I've left a really big loop on one end because what I want to be able to do is have a J clasp fit inside that, and if I make that too tiny, the J clasp won't then fit inside the loop. The loop into which I'm attaching the J clasp is minute, it's tiny, so you'll have slightly longer loop on one end than you will on the other. Let's get that back in the correct orientation. So you can also use a pre-made clasp if you prefer. And you could put in a jump ring or a soldered jump ring, whichever you prefer, whichever technique you'd like to use. The main thing is we've got our first crimp bead in position, which has set the tension on the leaves. I'm now going to leave, as I say, an oversized loop on this end. And I'm just going to draw that crimp ever so slightly away from the aqua bead, just to give us enough space before crimping. I draw the aqua bead over as far as I can and then bend that beading thread out and away, making sure that I'm bending the beading thread at the point that I'm going to cut it, not the piece of beading thread that still exists in the bracelet. So again, look twice, cut once, and then there shouldn't be any tears. She says as she probably then goes and cuts the wrong bit live, which is quite funny sometimes, but also not. And then we would apply our crimp bead covers. Now I will show you how unskilled I am at putting crimp bead covers on. Now there are people out there that use the technique of applying the crimp bead crimping tool, which I forgot the name of for a hot second there, which is a set of pliers. Let me just grab my regular pliers, which has got 2 little divots in them, and a lot of people love them. And the first divot squashes the crimp flat, and the second divot turns it around into a C shape. Now that means that you can get a much tidier finish. However, in the 12 years since I've been using crimp beads, I much prefer to leave them flat. You have to go with what is best for you. So I'm going to show you now how abysmally I can put a crimp bead on. So let's just pop a crimp bead over that section. I tend to hold it from underneath so that the little open section is upwards. And then I'm just going to try and close that neatly. Doesn't always happen in one go. And I tend to then hold it ever so slightly differently and just squeeze that shut. Now that's not the worst crimp bead cover I've ever done, but I know that there are lots of people out there who will do that much more neatly. We then add a second one. What I'm going to do now, rather than bore you with the exact same thing on the second side, is take a piece of scrap wire, if I have any in the right... No, I don't. Let's take a piece from the reel. So this would need to be 18 or 16 gauge, and it doesn't need to be a huge amount of wire. I'm just going to create for you now a J hook. Now, when you create the second half of your bracelet, on this end we made a very large loop. On the other end, we'll be putting the wrapped loop in before you crimp a very, very tiny loop. So I'm going to show you how to make the J-hook, but I could find a piece of wire, I guess, to add that onto, but I just want to show you how to make the J-hook because it's in a pinch, something that you can use to finish a piece of jewellery really, really quickly. So as with everything we ever do, I'm taking my section of wire. This is 18 gauge round. It can be medium temper, as this one was, or it can be a softer wire. I'm going to give that a smooth through so that it's nice and warm. If your camera wobbled, I'm very, very sorry about that. There we go. So that's nice and smooth and warm. It's less than 3 inches of wire it takes to make one of these. So if you're working in precious metals, it can be quite a thrifty way just to come up with the little crimp, the little closure rather. So I'm going to make sure that my end is flush cut, and I'm going to make the world's tiniest half circle. So starting right at the end of the wire, right at the end of those pliers, it's almost like a half circle, like the end of a crook. We're just going to ignore that for a second. What we're going to do is make a much larger circle shape away from that now, and once I've made the form I will show it to you because it will be easier. So our half circle is facing out this way, and then the main circle comes back in the opposite direction. I'm going to give that a little bit of a harden, but I'm not hardening the half circle just yet. What we're going to do with that half circle is try and squish it down. So I'm using the very end of my pliers now, just to bring that round into a squashed half circle before squish, squeeze. Sometimes it goes sideways. If it does, you can rescue it just by bringing it back like so. What we're trying to do is, rather than making a circle or a loop on the end, we're making a squishy loop on the end before we make that nice and flat. The cut end of the wire needs to meet the section of wire that comes up so that it doesn't catch on things, but you're creating almost like a shepherd's crook form. Then you can give that a really good squash. You could hammer it if you have hammer and block. Before warming through the longer tail, I'm going to put a little bit of an angle just here, just next to that squashy half circle, before putting my pliers across the design. So we're currently looking at this loop down at the bottom, which is flat to the table. What we need to do now is bring a right angle away from that, so we're working at 90 degrees. And then we are returning with the round nose pliers. So round nose pliers, again, we're just making a wrapped loop now all the way around. Like so. It needs to be a nice circular form. Now at this juncture, you could put this onto the loop on the other end of your beading thread, which will be a much smaller loop. Because I'm making this to go on the other end of this bracelet, I'm just going to take this off, but that's how you would attach it to the bracelet. So just leave that attached to the shorter end. And what we're going to do now is support the loop shape. Again, if you've got your beading thread in there, you're not crushing the beading thread. I'm going to take the tail of wire. Let me show you how that's circling around. It's basically, yep, you guessed it, another wrapped loop. And I want to take that around a couple of times so that it looks really neat and tidy. What we're going to do now is trim away as near as possible to the squashy loop that we made to begin with. Again, you look twice before you cut once. And then you may need to use 2 pairs of pliers just to hold the loop section with the bracelet inside it whilst you tidy that last little coil down. It's much easier to do when there is beading thread in the end because it gives you something to grip a hold of rather than just gripping a hold of a very teeny loop. So that is how to make your own emergency clasp. So this would be attached to the other mirrored side and it can then go through the oversized loop. So if I bring both pieces in together, let's take that loop out, it looks rather ridiculous. This is the 18 gauge in the silver, so let me flip this over to show you the 20 gauge in the copper colour. So just to recap a couple of things before I bring you back up to the other camera. If I'm wearing this as a bracelet, I would only put the heart on one side. The reason I put the heart on 2 sides today is to show you the difference, what it looks like with 20 gauge, 18 gauge. I just like going to the opticians. 18 gauge, 20 gauge. Better, worse, red, green. So that is your Capture My Heart bracelet. If you have any questions, I will absolutely be around in comments for a little while. and hopefully I will be able to answer as many as I can. If I didn't see your comment live today, I'm terribly sorry. I will try and catch up with that now. As ever, Facebook was being a tad Facebooky. Have yourself a beautiful, beautiful day, no matter what the rest of it is you're doing. You guys in America have just got to the weekend. I'm halfway through it. I'll see you again next week here on the Jessie James Facebook page. All hearts to everyone at Jessie James Beads. To you. Take care. Bye for now.